On August 15, 2001, a 22-year-old graduate student named Clara Rossi walked into Boston's Cathedral of the Holy Cross for her nephew's christening and was never seen again. For 12 agonizing years, her disappearance remained one of the city's most baffling cold cases, a wound that refused to heal for a family trapped in a state of perpetual uncertainty. The investigation hit dead end after dead end, with no witnesses, no ransom note, and no body. It was as if the hallowed walls of the cathedral had simply swallowed her whole. Then, a decade later, an accidental discovery in a charity donation bin, a child's christening gown with a hidden object sewn into its lining, cracked the case wide open, exposing a truth far more sinister than anyone could have ever imagined. How is it possible that the key to such a dark secret was hidden in plain sight for so long? Before I tell you how a simple christening gown found in a donation bin unraveled a criminal conspiracy operating from the heart of the cathedral, comment below where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss the chain of events this single discovery set in motion. What started as a search for one missing woman would soon expose a network of corruption that had thrived for years, protected by the very institution that promised sanctuary. The story of Clara Rossi is not just about a disappearance. It's about how a family's relentless love for one of their own finally brought a powerful and hidden evil into the light, forcing a reckoning that would shake the city of Boston to its core and demand answers from those who believed they were above reproach. Clara Rossi was the kind of person who seemed to radiate light. At 22, she was a brilliant graduate student at Boston College, dedicating her studies to the restoration of sacred art. It wasn't just a career path for her. It was a calling. She saw history and soul in the fading pigments of old paintings and the worn stone of forgotten statues. Her dream was to one day work at the cloisters in New York, or a grand European museum, preserving the very beauty she held so dear. She was deeply devoted to her family, especially her older sister, Anna, and was overjoyed to be named godmother to her first nephew, Leo. Her vulnerability wasn't a weakness, but a profound trust in the inherent goodness of people, a trust that was especially strong within the sacred spaces she loved. She was not a person with enemies. She was a hopeful soul, standing on the precipice of a bright future. The day she vanished, August 15, 2001, was meant to be a landmark of family joy. The Rossi family had gathered at the imposing Cathedral of the Holy Cross for the christening of baby Leo. The date coincided with the Feast of the Assumption, and the historic church was teeming with hundreds of worshippers, the air thick with the scent of incense and the low murmur of prayer. It was a typical Boston scene, a blend of old-world reverence and the chaotic anonymity of a major city celebration. For the Rossis, the crowd was just background noise to a deeply personal and happy occasion. They found their seats in the pews, filled with anticipation, completely unaware that in a matter of minutes their lives would be irrevocably fractured by a single, inexplicable moment of silence that would stretch into years of unanswered questions. The ceremony was just minutes from beginning when baby Leo began to fuss, his cries cutting through the solemn atmosphere. Clara, with her natural, calming presence, immediately stood up. She smiled at her sister Anna, taking the baby into her arms. "I'll take him to a quieter side chapel to soothe him," she whispered. A few parishioners later recalled seeing a young woman gently rocking an infant near a side altar dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Moments later, Clara returned to the pew, handing the now peaceful baby back to his mother. Leaning in close to Anna, she said her final words, a simple promise that would haunt her family forever. "I'm going to light a candle for him. I'll be back in a minute." Anna, distracted by the priest's final preparations, simply nodded. Clara turned and melted back into the dense throng of people moving through the nave. At first her absence was barely noticed. The family assumed she had run into a friend from her university, or was simply taking a moment for herself. But as 5 minutes turned into 15, a quiet unease began to settle over them. The priest was ready to begin the christening, and Clara's seat remained empty. Anna's husband went to check the side chapels and the cathedral entrance, but found no sign of her. The initial flicker of concern soon ignited into full-blown panic. The ceremony was postponed as family members began a frantic, hushed search through the cavernous building, their calls of her name swallowed by the stone archways. Within an hour, the Boston police were called, but their initial search yielded nothing. It was impossible. In the middle of a crowded service, surrounded by family and strangers, Clara Rossi had vanished as if she were never there. The initial hours of the investigation were a portrait of institutional failure. The Boston Police Department, arriving at a scene that was both a place of worship and a potential crime scene, seemed overwhelmed. The sheer volume of people who had been inside the cathedral made securing the area impossible. Parishioners had come and gone, taking with them any potential evidence or fleeting observations. The first officers on the scene treated the situation with a frustrating lack of urgency, defaulting to the dismissive theory that a 22-year-old woman had simply had a change of heart. Perhaps she met a secret lover, they suggested. Maybe she got cold feet about her life. To the Rossi family, who knew Clara's unwavering dedication, these suggestions were not just insulting, they were a critical waste of time, allowing the crucial window for finding her to slam shut, while authorities pursued baseless and lazy assumptions. As days turned into weeks, the official investigation sputtered. Detectives interviewed dozens of people who were at the cathedral that day, but their accounts were a blur of faces in a crowd. No one saw anything unusual, no struggle, no suspicious individuals leading a young woman away. In 2001, comprehensive CCTV coverage was not the standard it is today, especially inside a historic church. The cathedral was a technological blind spot. The police were left with nothing tangible, no forensic evidence, no witnesses, no motive. Clara's life was an open book, a dedicated student, a loving family member, no secret debts, no hidden relationships. Her digital footprint was virtually non-existent. The case file grew thick with reports that all said the same thing. Clara Rossi was there one moment and gone the next, leaving behind only a void. The Archdiocese of Boston publicly pledged its full cooperation, offering prayers for Clara's safe return and opening the cathedral to investigators. But behind the scenes, the Rossi family felt a different reality. Their interactions with church officials were stilted, formal, and guarded. It seemed to them that the institution was more concerned with managing its public image and preventing a scandal than with providing genuine assistance. Every question about church personnel, access to restricted areas, or internal records was met with bureaucratic delays and vague reassurances. The family began to feel that the very walls they had once seen as a sanctuary were now part of a fortress of silence, protecting secrets they couldn't begin to comprehend. Their faith, once a source of comfort, was now a source of deep and painful mistrust. For Anna, Clara's older sister, the disappearance became a private prison of guilt. The last words exchanged between them, "I'll be back in a minute," played on an endless loop in her mind. She tortured herself with 1,000 what-ifs. What if she had insisted Clara stay in the pew? What if she had gone with her to light the candle? The joy of her son Leo's birth was forever tainted by the tragedy that accompanied it. Every milestone for Leo was a painful reminder of the godmother he would never know. Anna's grief was a complicated, suffocating thing, woven with the threads of love, loss, and a crushing sense of responsibility. She felt as though she had let her sister walk into darkness, and the weight of that final, casual nod was something she would carry for the rest of her life. Clara's parents, Marco and Sophia Rossi, seemed to age a decade in a matter of months. They were devout Catholics, people who had built their lives around their faith and their community. Clara's disappearance from the heart of that faith shattered their world. The church, once their refuge, now felt like a place of betrayal. Marco, a quiet and stoic man, retreated into a shell of silent sorrow, his anger at the police and the archdiocese simmering just beneath the surface. Sophia, who had always been so vibrant, became frail, her prayers for Clara's return slowly morphing into hollow whispers of despair. The family home, once filled with the sound of Clara's passion for art and history, fell quiet. It was a silence, heavy with absence, a constant, aching reminder of the daughter who was simply gone. Over the next few years, the case officially went cold. The detective originally assigned to it retired, and Clara Rossi's file was passed down, becoming just another box on a shelf in the cold case unit. For the Rossis, however, the search never ended. Their life became a grim cycle of false hope and crushing disappointment. Cruel tips would surface. A supposed sighting in another state, a psychic's vision, a wild theory linking her to a religious cult. Each time, their hearts would leap with a desperate flicker of possibility, only to be extinguished when the lead went nowhere. These moments were almost worse than the silence, as each one forced them to relive the initial trauma, reopening the wound just as it was beginning to scar over. They were trapped in a limbo of ambiguous loss, unable to grieve and unable to move on. Every August 15th, the Rossi family would perform a heartbreaking ritual. They would return to the Cathedral of the Holy Cross, not to worship, but to stand on the steps outside. For hours, they would hand out flyers with Clara's smiling face printed on them, her eyes full of the life that had been stolen. They would speak to anyone who would listen, repeating the story that had become their entire existence. It was an act of defiance, a refusal to let their daughter be forgotten by the city and the institution that had failed to protect her. For the family, the cathedral was no longer a house of God. It was a monument to their unanswered questions, a cold stone tomb holding the secret of what happened to their beloved Clara. 12 years later, in the crisp autumn of October 2013, the city of Boston had largely forgotten the name Clara Rossi. Her case had become a footnote in the city's complex history of unsolved crimes, a ghost story whispered among older parishioners. For the Rossi family, however, time had not moved forward. It had simply circled the same day, August 15, 2001, for over a decade. The world had changed, but their grief remained static, a permanent fixture in their lives. In a quiet corner of the South End, inside a St. Vincent de Paul donation center connected to the cathedral's parish, the mundane cycle of charity continued. Bags of forgotten clothes, discarded housewares, and old books arrived daily, each item carrying the faint echo of a life left behind. It was here, amidst the scent of mothballs and dust, that the first crack in 12 years of silence was about to appear. Margaret O'Connell, a volunteer at the center for nearly 2 decades, was sorting through a new delivery of donations. At 78, her movements were methodical, her hands practiced in the art of separating the wearable from the worn. Most of the bags contained the usual assortment of faded T-shirts and outdated sweaters. But one stood out, a sealed, clear plastic bag, the kind used for storing precious garments. Inside lay a delicate batiste christening gown, its white fabric yellowed slightly with age, but otherwise immaculately preserved. It looked like something from another era, carefully kept for a special occasion that had long since passed. Margaret placed it aside, intending to mark it for the vintage section, thinking of the anonymous family who had let such a beautiful heirloom go. It was a small, sad mystery, but nothing out of the ordinary for her line of work. As Margaret lifted the gown to inspect its condition, her fingers brushed against a hard, unyielding lump sewn into the inner lining near the hem. It wasn't a button or a forgotten pin. It felt heavy, solid, and deliberately hidden. Her curiosity, a trait that had never faded with age, took over. With a small pair of scissors from her sewing kit, she carefully snipped the threads of the inner seam, pulling it apart, just enough to see what was inside. Out fell a tarnished silver medallion, heavy in her palm. It was cold to the touch, and bore no resemblance to a typical St. Christopher medal or crucifix. Engraved on its surface was a strange, unfamiliar symbol, a pelican piercing its own breast to feed its young, positioned above a small, closed book. It felt ancient, secretive, and profoundly out of place. Unsure what to make of the peculiar object, Margaret knew it wasn't something to be simply priced and put on a shelf. It felt important. She wrapped the medallion and the gown in tissue paper and took them to Father Michael, the parish priest who oversaw the donation center. He, too, was baffled by the symbol. Recognizing that the gown itself might hold sentimental value for someone, he decided on a simple course of action. He took a photograph of the gown and the strange medallion and placed a small notice in the weekly church bulletin under the Lost and Found section. It read, "Vintage christening gown and unusual silver medallion found in donation. Please contact the parish office if this belongs to you." It was a small gesture, a shot in the dark, intended to reunite a keepsake with its owner. A few days later, Anna Rossi was visiting her parents. On the kitchen table lay the latest bulletin from the cathedral parish, something her mother still picked up every Sunday out of a deeply ingrained habit that now felt more like a punishment. Anna's eyes scanned the page disinterestedly until they landed on the small, grainy, black-and-white photo. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the gown. She would know it anywhere. Near the bottom hem, barely visible in the poor-quality print, she could just make out the shape of the tiny bluebird she had painstakingly embroidered herself, a secret little symbol of hope for her newborn son, Leo. A wave of nausea and adrenaline washed over her. After 12 years of dead ends and false hope, here was a piece of that day. A piece of her life she thought was lost forever, returned like a ghost. The Rossi family contacted the Boston Police Department that same afternoon. The call was initially met with the weary skepticism reserved for cold cases, but when Anna described the gown and the hidden medallion, the tone on the other end of the line shifted. For the first time in over a decade, they had a new piece of physical evidence directly tied to the day of Clara's disappearance. The dusty boxes containing the Clara Rossi file were retrieved from the archives. Detectives, younger and more technologically equipped than their predecessors, took possession of the gown and medallion. The gown was confirmed as Leo's, but the medallion was the true enigma. It did not belong to the Rossi family. It had been sewn into the lining by someone else, for some other purpose. The case was no longer just about a missing person. It was now about a hidden message. The medallion was immediately sent for analysis. While forensics found no usable prints on the tarnished silver, a symbology expert at Boston College, Clara's own alma mater, provided the breakthrough. The image of the pelican feeding its young from its own blood was an old Christian symbol of sacrifice, but its specific rendering over a closed book was the key. It was the exclusive emblem of a discreet and powerful lay society known as the Custodians' Trust. The expert's report described the group as an old, secretive organization composed of influential church staff and wealthy Boston patrons. Officially, their mission was to, quote, preserve sacred heritage, but the closed book in their symbol suggested a different interpretation, knowledge that was meant to be kept secret. Suddenly, the investigation had a target, a shadowy group operating from within the very walls of the cathedral. The investigation now had a name, the Custodians' Trust. With this single thread, detectives began unraveling a tapestry of secrets woven into the very fabric of the cathedral. They started by cross-referencing the society's history with the church's own records, meticulously examining the files of long-serving staff and prominent donors. One name consistently surfaced, Arthur Finch, a sexton who had worked at the cathedral for over 40 years before his recent death from natural causes. Finch was a fixture, a quiet, devout man who held the keys to every door and knew every hidden corner of the ancient building. He was seen as the epitome of loyalty, a guardian of the sacred space. His passing had seemed like the end of an era, but for investigators, it was an opportunity. They suspected his loyalty wasn't to God, but to the secrets the cathedral held deep within its stone walls. Detectives secured a warrant to search Finch's old office, a small, cramped room in the cathedral's labyrinthine basement that had been left untouched since his death. The space was a time capsule, filled with decades of church bulletins, repair logs, and the mundane effects of a long life of service. It initially appeared to be a dead end, another frustrating chapter in a story full of them. But one of the younger detectives, trained to see what others miss, noticed a subtle imperfection in Finch's heavy oak desk. The bottom drawer was misaligned by a fraction of an inch. A closer inspection revealed a masterfully crafted false bottom. With a pry bar, they carefully lifted the panel. There was no weapon, no cash, only a single heavy leather-bound ledger. Its pages were filled with neat, meticulous handwriting, a silent record of deeds that had been buried for decades. The ledger was a cryptic masterpiece, its entries spanning nearly 30 years. At first, the coded language was indecipherable, a mix of dates, the names of small rural parishes across New England, and strange phrases like, quote, acquisition of a 17th-century chalice, or placement of an angel. The Boston Police Department brought in a team of cryptologists and art historians from Boston College to help decipher it. The acquisitions, they soon realized, were a detailed inventory of priceless religious artifacts, statues, chalices, and rare paintings stolen from underfunded country churches. The custodian's trust wasn't preserving sacred heritage, it was systematically plundering it. The cathedral served as the perfect hub for their sophisticated art theft ring, using the constant flow of visitors and its reputation as a sanctuary to mask a criminal enterprise operating in plain sight. As shocking as the art theft was, it was the ledger's other secret that turned the investigators blood cold. The entries marked placement of an angel revealed a far more sinister operation. When cross-referenced with public records, these entries aligned perfectly with the births of children to young, vulnerable single mothers who had sought counseling at church-affiliated crisis centers. Angel was the trust's code for a baby. The placements were illegal adoptions. The organization was running a human trafficking pipeline, selling infants to wealthy childless European couples for sums recorded in the ledger as charitable donations. They were preying on the desperation of women at their lowest point, using the church's authority to coerce them into giving up their children while creating a paper trail of falsified documents to make it all disappear. With this horrifying revelation, Clara Rossi's disappearance finally snapped into terrifying focus. Her graduate studies were in sacred art restoration. Her eye was expertly trained to recognize the authenticity, history, and value of religious artifacts. On that August day, surrounded by the art she loved, she must have seen something she shouldn't have. Investigators theorized that she may have recognized a recently stolen statue in a side chapel, an item she knew belonged to a small parish she had studied. Or perhaps, while soothing her nephew, she overheard a hushed conversation about the shipment of an angel. A simple question, a look of recognition, would have been enough to expose them. She wasn't a random victim who had wandered off. She was a witness who had stumbled upon an evil hiding in a holy place. The ledger was a roadmap to the conspiracy, filled not just with transactions but with initials. Investigators worked tirelessly to connect these initials to individuals associated with the cathedral. One set appeared with alarming frequency next to the largest transactions, MD. The evidence pointed overwhelmingly to one man, Monsignor Michael Donovan, a high-ranking and universally respected administrator within the archdiocese. Donovan was the public face of the church's compassion, overseeing many of its charitable programs, including the very donation center where the gown was found. Another set of initials belonged to a prominent Boston businessman and philanthropist, whose international shipping company provided the perfect cover for moving stolen art overseas. The conspiracy wasn't just a few rogue employees. It was an alliance of power, reaching from the altar to the boardroom. The evidence was damning, but it was still circumstantial. The ledger proved a criminal enterprise existed, but it didn't explicitly link Donovan or his associates to Clara's disappearance. Investigators needed more. They needed a confession, or they needed to find Clara. They decided to apply pressure, starting with the weaker links in the chain whose initials appeared in the ledger. Confronted with irrefutable proof of their involvement in art theft and human trafficking, the smaller players began to break. One by one, they confessed, confirming the scope of the operation and the absolute authority of Monsignor Donovan. They described a man who masterfully used his clerical collar as a shield, orchestrating a criminal empire built on theft and human misery. The noose was tightening, and the truth about what happened to Clara Rossi was finally, after 12 long years, within reach. The final confrontation took place in a sterile, windowless interrogation room at Boston Police Headquarters, a place utterly devoid of the divine authority Monsignor Donovan had wielded his entire life. Dressed in his clerical blacks, he sat with a rigid posture, flanked by a high-powered lawyer from the archdiocese. For hours, he maintained an air of serene indignation, dismissing the ledger as a fabrication and the confessions of his subordinates as the desperate lies of guilty men. He spoke of his decades of service, his unwavering faith, and the absurdity of the accusations. But the detectives were relentless. They laid out photographs of the stolen art, financial records of the illegal adoptions, and the sworn statements of the men who had already confessed. They weren't accusing a priest. They were dismantling the alibi of a criminal mastermind, piece by agonizing piece. The first crack appeared not with a shout, but with a tremor. As a detective slid a photo of Clara Rossi across the table, a candid shot of her laughing, taken just weeks before she vanished, Donovan's hand, resting on the table, began to shake almost imperceptibly. His lawyer tried to intervene, but the detective pressed on, speaking softly. "She was one of yours, Monsignor, a devout girl who loved the church. She studied its art. She trusted its leaders. She just wanted to light a candle for her nephew." The words were not an accusation, but a eulogy, and they found their mark in the man behind the collar. The mask of piety began to dissolve, revealing the terrified face of someone who had been cornered by a ghost from his past. The serene confidence evaporated, replaced by the cold sweat of a man whose sins had finally come to collect. After 12 years of silence, the truth came pouring out in a torrent of self-pitying justification. It wasn't a murder, Donovan insisted, but a tragic, unforeseen accident. His voice, stripped of its homiletic power, was thin and reedy as he recounted the events of that day. Clara, with her expert knowledge, had recognized a 16th-century silver reliquary displayed near a side altar. She knew it belonged to a small, struggling parish in rural Maine. She had approached him after soothing her nephew, her question innocent but lethal. "Monsignor, isn't that the St. Jude reliquary from All Saints Church? I studied it for my thesis. What a wonderful surprise to see it here." In that single, curious question, she had unknowingly signed her own death warrant. She had seen the truth, and for the custodian's trust, there was no greater threat than an honest witness. Donovan confessed that he had calmly invited her into the sacristy, the private chamber behind the altar, under the pretense of explaining the reliquary's temporary loan. Once inside, his demeanor shifted. He and Arthur Finch tried to intimidate her, to convince her she was mistaken. But Clara was not easily cowed. Her devotion to sacred art was matched by a fierce sense of justice. She told them she knew what they were doing was wrong, and that she had to report it. She turned to leave, to tell her family, to go to the police. In a surge of pure panic, Donovan grabbed her arm to stop her. She pulled away, lost her footing on the polished stone floor, and fell backward. Her head struck the sharp corner of a heavy marble credenza with a sickening crack. There was no scream, just a sudden, horrifying silence. The cover-up was as cold and calculated as the crimes that preceded it. Finch, the sexton, was the architect of the plan. He knew every secret the cathedral held, every forgotten passage and sealed-off chamber. He reminded Donovan of the old pre-renovation crypt, a small, brick-lined space directly beneath the main sacristy that had been sealed in the 1950s during a modernization project. It was a tomb within a tomb, accessible only through a heavy flagstone hidden beneath an ornate rug. That night, under the cover of darkness, they moved Clara's body. They wrapped her in altar cloths, lowered her into the dusty void, and then resealed the entrance. The next day, Finch arranged for a construction crew to come in for a plumbing repair, pouring a new layer of concrete over the flagstone, burying Clara Rossi under a permanent, impenetrable seal of silence. Acting on the confession, a BPD forensic team entered the cathedral not as worshippers, but as excavators of a 12-year-old grave. The sacristy was declared a crime scene, the ornate rug pulled back to reveal the discolored patch of concrete exactly where Donovan had described. For hours, the sound of jackhammers echoed through the hallowed halls, a violent intrusion into a place of supposed peace. Finally, they broke through, revealing the dark, musty opening of the forgotten crypt. A single crime scene investigator, lowered into the space, confirmed what they all knew was coming. There, resting in the darkness, were the skeletal remains of a young woman. Clutched in her hand was a single melted stump of a votive candle, the one she had intended to light for her nephew, Leo. The search for Clara Rossi was finally, tragically, over. The news broke like a shockwave across the city. The arrest of a high-ranking Monsignor for murder sent the Archdiocese of Boston, already reeling from other scandals, into a complete tailspin. For the Rossi family, the confirmation of Clara's death was a unique and devastating form of agony. The faint, irrational hope they had clung to for over a decade was brutally extinguished, replaced by the stark reality of her murder. Anna was brought to the medical examiner's office to formally identify her sister's belongings. Seeing the simple dress Clara had worn to the christening, now a tattered piece of evidence, she finally collapsed into the grief she had held at bay for 12 years. The not knowing had been a special kind of hell, but knowing, it turned out, was its own unbearable inferno. Monsignor Donovan's trial became the biggest story in Boston, a media spectacle that pitted faith against a horrifying reality. The courtroom was a theater of silent tension, with the Rossi family sitting in the front row every single day, their faces a stoic mask of grief. The prosecution methodically laid out the case, presenting the sexton's ledger as the conspiracy's unholy scripture. They showed financial records tracing the sale of stolen art and trafficked infants, and brought the men who had confessed to the stand, their voices trembling as they implicated the man in the clerical collar. Donovan's defense team tried to paint him as a scapegoat, a man misled by others. But when the forensic evidence from the crypt was presented, photos of the concrete slab, the altar cloths, the single votive candle found with Clara's remains, the image of the pious servant of God was shattered forever, replaced by that of a cold, ruthless criminal. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When the foreman read the verdict, guilty on all counts, including murder in the first degree, a collective gasp swept through the courtroom. There were no cheers from the Rossi family, only a quiet, shuddering release of breath. It wasn't a moment of victory. It was the final, brutal confirmation of their loss. At his sentencing, Monsignor Donovan, stripped of his title and his clerical garb, stood as just a man. He received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. His accomplices, including the businessman whose shipping company had been essential to the operation, received sentences ranging from 20 to 40 years. Justice, in the eyes of the law, had been served, but for the Rossis it was a hollow sound, an echo in a house that would never again be filled with their daughter's laughter. For Anna, the truth was a double-edged sword. The crushing guilt she had carried for 12 years, the belief that she had somehow failed her sister in that final moment, was finally lifted. But in its place came the vivid, agonizing knowledge of Clara's last, terrifying minutes. She could see it all, the sacristy, the confrontation, the fall. She found herself unable to step inside a church for years, the scent of incense now triggering a wave of nausea. Her son, Leo, was now a teenager, old enough to understand the weight of the story. One evening, Anna sat him down and told him everything, not just about the godmother he never knew, but about her bravery. She explained that Clara had died not just as a victim, but as a hero who had stumbled upon a great evil and refused to look away. Marco and Sofia Rossi never truly recovered. The trial, while providing answers, had also forced them to relive every parent's worst nightmare in excruciating public detail. Their faith, once the bedrock of their lives, was gone, replaced by a profound and bitter disillusionment. They sold the family home, unable to bear the silence in Clara's old room, and moved to a quiet town on the Cape, seeking an anonymity the city could no longer offer. Marco passed away just 2 years after the trial, his heart, Sophia said, having simply given out from the strain of it all. Sophia lived on for a few more years, a ghost of her former self, finding solace only in tending her garden and speaking to a framed photograph of her daughter, a bright, smiling girl forever frozen at 22. The conspiracy had not just taken one life, it had slowly extinguished 2 more. The scandal forced a painful and public reckoning within the Archdiocese of Boston. Facing immense pressure, a new bishop issued a formal, unequivocal apology to the Rossi family and to the faithful who had been so deeply betrayed. An internal investigation was launched, leading to the quiet dismissal of several other church officials who had, at best, turned a blind eye to the activities of the Custodians' Trust. The Cathedral of the Holy Cross, once a symbol of sanctuary, became a site of pilgrimage for those mourning not just Clara, but their own lost faith. Years later, a small, unassuming bronze plaque was installed in the side chapel where Clara was last seen. It reads, "In memory of Clara Rossi, may her light shine in the darkness." It was a small gesture against a monumental crime, a quiet admission of a sin that could never be fully absolved. In the end, it was Anna and Leo who ensured Clara's legacy would be one of action, not just memory. They established the Clara Rossi Light Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing legal and emotional support to families of missing persons, particularly in cases involving powerful institutions. They fought for legislation demanding greater transparency and accountability from tax-exempt organizations. Leo, who grew up in the long shadow of his godmother's absence, became the foundation's most passionate advocate. He would often tell his mother that he felt a connection to the woman he never met, a duty to honor her courage. The christening gown, once a symbol of a stolen future, was now preserved by the foundation, a tangible reminder that, sometimes, the smallest forgotten object holds the power to expose the darkest secrets and bring a long-buried truth into the light. If you believe that no victim should be forgotten and that the search for truth is essential, please share this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth investigations into cases that need to be told. Thank you for listening. The story of Clara Rossi is more than a chronicle of a crime. It is a profound lesson in the fragility of trust. For decades, the Cathedral of the Holy Cross stood as an unassailable symbol of faith for the city of Boston. But the revelation of the Custodians' Trust exposed a deep rot beneath the sacred stone, forcing an entire community to confront the horrifying possibility that evil could thrive not in the shadows of alleyways, but in the hallowed halls of a sanctuary. The case left an indelible scar on the city's psyche, a painful reminder that institutions, no matter how revered, are made of fallible people capable of profound darkness. The silence that had protected Donovan and his conspirators for so long was finally broken, not by the authorities, but by the relentless love of a family that simply refused to let their daughter be erased. Out of this darkness, Anna and Leo forged a new kind of light. The Clara Rossi Light Foundation became a powerful force for change, a testament to Clara's own unwavering sense of justice. It was not just a support group, it was an advocacy powerhouse. They successfully lobbied for Clara's Law in Massachusetts, a piece of legislation that mandated stricter financial transparency and independent oversight for large, tax-exempt charitable organizations, making it harder for corruption to hide behind a veil of piety. The foundation provided pro bono legal services to families of the missing, helping them navigate the bureaucratic mazes that had once so frustrated the Rossis. In this way, Clara's name became synonymous not with tragedy, but with empowerment. Her memory became a shield for others, ensuring her story would prevent future victims from suffering in silence. For Leo, the weight of his godmother's story was a legacy he embraced with solemn purpose. He grew up knowing he was the reason she had stepped away from the pew, the innocent catalyst for a tragedy that reshaped his entire family. But Anna had raised him not to feel guilt, but to feel a sense of duty. He became the public face of the foundation, speaking with an eloquence and passion that belied his years. He often kept the small, tarnished silver medallion, the one found in his christening gown, in his pocket during public appearances. It served as a tangible link to the woman he never knew, a constant reminder of the secret she had died to expose. He wasn't just living for himself, he was living to honor the brave godmother who had wanted to do nothing more than light a candle for him. Ultimately, the case of Clara Rossi serves as a stark and timeless warning. It demonstrates how easily the architecture of power and reverence can be used to conceal the most depraved of crimes. It shows that evil is not always a monstrous stranger, but can wear a familiar and trusted face. Yet, it is also a story of incredible hope. It proves that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of finding its way to the surface. It affirms that the persistent, unwavering love of a family can be a more powerful investigative tool than any police force. The christening gown, a forgotten relic of a joyful day, became the thread that unraveled a criminal empire, reminding us all that sometimes justice doesn't arrive with a thunderclap, but with the quiet discovery of a single, misplaced object. If you believe that no victim should be forgotten and that the search for truth is essential, please share this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth investigations into cases that need to be told. Thank you for listening.